Could you introduce yourself, say your name, and say what it is that you do?
My name is Jeff Berglund. I'm the chair of the Department of Global Tourism in the Faculty of Global Engagement at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. My wife and I have our own English school that we've had for 48 years, and I teach students there at home. We have the school at home, and I have three regular TV programs, and I do a lot of public speaking, but I do about 50 public speeches a year. But this coronavirus time, it's way down because most of them are now online.
What is your earliest memory of film or television, whichever one you remember earliest?
I think I remembered television before film because I think I was only 2 or 3 years old when I started watching television. And the program I liked most, I don't remember if it's the first one I ever saw, but was Mighty Mouse. But I also liked the Howdy Doody show. And then the shows that we watched as a family, like Father Knows Best and Lassie, Leave It to Beaver. The first movie I remember going on Saturday afternoons, Saturday matinee, and it was almost always the Cisco Kid.
What kind of hobbies did you have growing up?
When I was really little, I collected bottle caps. People now might not know what bottle caps are. They think of those caps on plastic bottles. Bottle caps were on glass bottles, and they had a small cork cap. You put the cap on the bottle using pressure, squeeze the cap into the top of the bottle so the bottle opened. So I tried to open bottles without bending the cap so I would have flat caps. And I think I had more than 1,000 caps. I really had a lot of them, different colors and designs, and most of the caps had the name of the product. All of the soda-like drinks, all of the beer, different beer makers. So I would go around to restaurants and stores and ask for the bottle caps. Some people were nice and they saved the bottle caps for me in boxes. And then when I got older, it was sort of a natural progression to coins. Of course, didn't have a lot of money, so I collected 1-cent coins. And I had a fairly full collection. Of course, I didn't have the really rare coins. The ones that were misprinted had some flaw that made them very valuable. But I had a fairly full collection. And then I got into 5-cent and the nickels. And then my father he bought a silver dollar collection, the books that you put them in. So those were my hobbies when I was little.
Grow up?
I was born in Mitchell, South Dakota. We moved to Aberdeen when I was 2.5, and then when I was 5, we moved to Bloomington, Minnesota. So I went to elementary school in Bloomington, Minnesota, and just when I finished 6th grade, the summer after 6th grade, we moved to Rapid City, South Dakota. That's where I went to junior and senior high school. So South Dakota and Minnesota are side by side geographically, but South Dakota is an extremely dry place. Minnesota is an extremely wet place. It's known as the land of 10,000 lakes. South Dakota has changed its motto and is now called the Rushmore State, but when I was little, it was called the Sunshine State, along with 5 or 10 other states that are the Sunshine State. So I grew up in what we would call cities with names: Mitchell, Aberdeen, Bloomington, and Rapid City. But all of them were small, very small towns. Bloomington had just started. It wasn't an incorporated city yet. It was still a suburb of Minneapolis. And we were in a new housing area. So I grew up in places where I could play outside a lot. There was a lot of open land. In South Dakota, we had enough space behind the house that we used to play wiffle ball. Joshua, do you know wiffle ball?
I do. The yep.
So you don't hit the ball too far because it has holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't break your neighbor's windows.
Yep.
Yeah, we had the same thing in Minnesota. We used to put third base was a small rubber swimming pool with water in it, and we played in our swimming suits. So if you got to third base, everyone always slid in third base, even if they don't hit a home run. They wanted to jump into the swimming pool to get cool. But I grew up in places where people didn't lock their doors. People often left their keys in the car, even when they went like downtown or shopping, so that if someone had to move the car, they could move the car. So I grew up in a very, very white, very, very rural area.
You talked about your high schooling. Where did you go to college?
I went to Carlton College in Minnesota. The year I was born, 49. Anyway, right around there, Russians shot up Sputnik, and all of a sudden the United States felt that they were behind in the space race. So there was this huge accent on science education, science and math education. So when I started elementary school, it was a experimental program. And kids that did well in science and math, you could go as fast as you wanted. So there was a group of 4 of us. By the time we were in 6th grade, we were up doing high school calculus. And science, we were up into Einstein's general and specific theories of relativity. So it was a really advanced, we taught ourselves. When we had questions, we asked the teacher, or we went to the library. So when I moved to South Dakota after 6th grade, I was, in an advanced program, and they didn't have anything like that. So what they did is they just stuck me in the 8th grade, so I didn't go to 7th grade. So I graduated from Carlton when I turned 21 in April and graduated in June. But that's where I went to college. I didn't get my master's degree until much later, and I did that in a remote learning situation where I had to go to the States for 3 to 4 weeks of intense classes during times when I wasn't teaching here in the summer and winter. And then I had to write a lot of papers. It was actually much more work than a usual master's program. My master's thesis is 500 pages long, has over 1,000 citations, and it's written on a topic that no one had written on before. So my son, who does have a PhD from the University of Tokyo, helped me format my master's degree. And he said that it wasn't a master's degree, it was a PhD. But I was in a program that only gave a master's degree, didn't have a PhD program. So I never got a PhD.
How did you end up studying abroad in Japan?
So at Carleton, I majored in religion. Religion is often called comparative religion, but we didn't really compare in the sense of we studied the basic texts, history, practices of the 5 major religions. Judaism and Christianity that comes from Judaism. Judaism is known as the oldest religion. Hinduism and Buddhism that came from Hinduism, and then Islam. And I'd grown up in a very church-going family. My father's brother, my uncle, was a Baptist minister. We went to the Baptist church, Northern Baptist, not Southern Baptist. Northern Baptists are the people who it's okay to smoke if it's done moderately, or drink alcohol if it's done moderately. It's okay to go to movies and dance. Southern Baptists are very strict about all of those things. So I grew up in a very, very Christian background. But when I was little, it always bothered me, this, especially the creation story, the 6th day when God creates man and says to have dominion over everything else he's created. And I lived in places that were so big, so wide, especially in Rapid City when we were right near the Black Hills, which are sacred mountains to the Lakota. And I felt the power of the nature. And I thought, there's no way we can have dominion over all of this. And when I got into religion in Carleton, and started to study Buddhism, I felt an affinity to Buddhism because it answered the basic question I'd always had. If you get into religion, you also get into philosophy. And so most people are familiar with the phrase, God is dead, which is Schopenhauer. And the reason Schopenhauer said God is dead is because God, all omnipresent being, outside of time and outside of space, became man, so came into time, and actually died on the cross and was resurrected in 3 days and became God again. So Schopenhauer is talking about how is this possible that a being which is outside of time comes into time, and not only comes into time, but actually goes through the process of dying, going out of time. And that's what God is dead comes from. And then you have Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who carries that on and says that to be Christian is to believe in the unbelievable and to hold that thing which is unbelievable as the central core of your Christian life. It's impossible to believe that God came into time and then died in time. So he calls it the Christian paradox. So that had always bothered me too. The two, that one that were in control of everything, or were supposed to be taking care of everything, and the other one was this Christian paradox. So when I got into Buddhism, where it said the process of meditation itself leads in a life force direction, that I really got interested in Buddhism. And just when I became interested in Buddhism, I had a chance to work at what's called the Northern Baptist Assembly Grounds in Wisconsin. They have an 18-hole golf course and an Olympic swimming pool, and they're on what's called Green Lake. It's a lake, so they had water skiing and fishing, tennis courts, big resort hotel, bungalows, camping area for people who wanted to bring their tents and camp. It was a huge, huge complex. They had about 40 or 50 university students working there as lifeguards in the swimming pool, groundskeepers, waiter and waitress in the restaurants, things like that. And I was a dishwasher. And I got there one night before we were supposed to check in. We were supposed to check in the next day. But they let me stay in the dormitory, and there was a Japanese international student who had just arrived in the United States, hadn't started school yet, who was going to work during the summer and then go to school in September. So he and I were stuck in this room because we were the only two that were there early. And I was the first Oriental person I'd ever met. The first black person I ever met was the year before that at Carlton. My first roommate was black. So I'd never talked to a black person. I'd never talked to an Asian person. But here I was with a Japanese student, fresh from Japan, so his English wasn't very good. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience, but a lot of the students that I've taken to the United States for homestay get very close to their homestay families, and it's often because their English is not so good. My specialty now in the field of intercultural communication is the field that I got my master's degree in, is nonverbal communication. And nonverbal communication is easily more than 90% of communication. There are a lot of differences between verbal and nonverbal communication, but one of the main differences is that verbal communication is digital, nonverbal communication is analogic. And because of that, verbal communication is very good for content, getting, for example, for this interview. When you want to do something, when you want to build a bridge, or when you want to write a book, language is necessary. It's very important. But language is one of the other big differences. Language is a new thing, maybe 20,000 years old. Written language, less than 6,000 years old, closer to actually 3,000 years old. So we've communicated non-verbally for a much longer time. So our non-verbal communication skills are highly developed. Just as an aside, during this coronavirus pandemic, one of our greatest nonverbal communication skills is reading facial expression. We read up to 20,000 different facial expressions. So we have extremely developed facial recognition. And with face masks, we can only see from the nose up. And a lot of facial expression takes place in the lower face. So there's a big problem with people not being able to read facial expression. But anyway, when people don't have language, they only have nonverbal communication, as I did with the Japanese student or my students that I took, and they were in homestay situations in the States. When you rely more on nonverbal communication is very good for what we call relationship building. It's much better than language. Language is a divider because it's digital. It divides into black and white. So if you have a group of 10 people and they don't know each other, you can sit in a circle and have them introduce themselves. I mean, eventually they'll get to know each other. But if you take those same 10 people and start them outside in a circle with a volleyball and have, Americans don't do this very much, but in Japan, 9 people would be in a big circle and one person in the middle, and you take turns passing, volleyball style, passing the ball, not using your hands to throw it, but into the center and back out, into the center and back out, into the center and back out. And everyone counts how many times you can keep the ball in the air without someone making a mistake. And you do that for 10 minutes. Those people are bonded. A greater bonding is dancing together, eating together, drinking together. All of those nonverbal communication activities are good for relationship building. If you talk about probably the most important relationship for human beings, it's for procreation, to carry on the species, to pass on genes. And that's an act, it's a nonverbal act between a man and a woman. You can't make a baby verbally. You can make a bridge verbally, but you can't make a baby verbally. So I got really close to this Japanese young man, probably because his English wasn't very good. I didn't know any Japanese. So we didn't have a lot of verbal communication. And I became really interested in him. And because I became interested in him, and I was also interested in Buddhism. And at that time, just around, I graduated from college in 1970. In the late 60s, a man named Suzuki Taisetsu, who was the head of the Zen Institute in Kyoto, was writing books in English about Zen. He was writing about Zen there are 3 sects of Zen, Rinzai, Soto, and Obaku. And he was writing about Rinzai. So I became really interested in Japan because of this Japanese student, because of the writings of Suzuki Taisetsu that I was reading, and because of this way I was drawn to Buddhism. So that's how I got interested in Japan. And then after the summer working, the Japanese student and I were dishwashers in one of the restaurants. After the summer, I went back to campus, and there was a poster right in front of me when I went back to campus that said, religion seminar in Japan. So I said, I got to apply for this. So I applied and got a scholarship to come back the next summer, the summer of 69. The summer I met the Japanese, it was 1968. And so I came back to Japan in 1969 on what was called the Carlton Summer Seminar, Religion in Japan. And I opted to stay after the summer seminar in the fall semester at Doshishin University in Kyoto. So I ended up living in Kyoto for most of the summer seminar was also in Kyoto, because Kyoto is the sort of the cultural treasure chest of Japan. If you want to study religion, Japanese religions, Shinto, Buddhism, there are so many shrines and temples right in Kyoto. 17 World Heritage Sites, 3 shrines and 14 temples, 13 temples and one castle. So most of the summer seminar was also in Kyoto. We did travel to called the head temple of different sects. So we went to Minobu-san, we went to Koya-san, we went to Kie-san, we went to Eihi, which is the head of the Soto sect of Zen. And we had talks by different religious leaders, translated into English. But I opted to stay on after the summer seminar at Doshishin University and study Japanese for an intense course. So I learned all of the 100 or so verb changes, which is the basic difficulty of Japanese, as well as enough kanji to read the newspaper. So not quite, almost. That was an intense Japanese course. And then I went back to the United States a couple of days before Christmas and went back to Carlton in January, graduated in June, and came back to Japan. One of my mentors at Carlton was John Perry. He's not the direct descendant, but it's from a cousin descendant of Commodore Perry, who's known as the black ship that opened Japan to the West at the end of the Edo period. So John Perry had always talked to me about Japan, and then he was really happy when I went to Japan for 6 months. But he and his family were going to be going to Tokyo. He was given a 1-year sabbatical to teach at Waseda University in Tokyo, and he asked me, why don't you come in? But he had 5 children that I used to babysit for. He's now 93 years old, and we still communicate. He has 14 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren, something like that. They're probably close to 30 now. But he asked me to come back with him and his family and help take care of the children because I spoke Japanese then, and I also read Japanese. So I came back with John and Holly and the kids. But right after we got back, I got a call from a teacher at Doshisha where I'd been before, that Doshisha High School needed a teacher for just a month. Their the English teacher from the United States had quit suddenly. Sudden English teacher. So I said, sure, I've never taught English, but it can't be that hard. So I came down back to Kyoto. I moved in with the same family that I'd lived with when I was a student. And I started this 1 month of teaching at Dosha High School. After a month, they asked me if I'd like to stay another month. And I called John and Holly and said, they want me to stay longer. And John said, well, that's okay. We're okay. So I stayed at Doshisha, completed that school year. And then they asked me to come on full time. And so I ended up teaching at Doshisha High School for 22 years before I moved up to the university level.
Prior to your move to Japan, what did you know about the country?
This is the 1960s. The 1960s were very different. In 1964, I worked for Barry Goldwater, who's known as the most conservative Republican who's ever run for president. But in 1968, I worked for Eugene McCarthy, who's known as one of the most liberal Democrats that's ever run for the presidency. So there was a big shift in how I saw the world. But I was, as most Americans were, quite parochial. There weren't Japanese classes in schools. There weren't Chinese classes. There was very little information about Asia. An American world history textbook in high school would have 3 to 5 pages on Asia, not just China or Japan. It would have 3 to 5 pages on Asia. That's all it had. So I knew almost nothing about it. In fact, I didn't even know it was an island country. I thought it was because I'd read about Japanese history and the history of Korea in between. I thought that the 3 countries were connected. I didn't know anything about Japan. And when I'd grown up, right after I was born in 1949, so that's 4 years after the war ends, but still Japan was struggling economically, devastated by World War II. And they were making a lot of very cheap product to sell to the world just to get American currency. They were trying to get dollars. And so we had a phrase, made in Japan, which referred to anything which was cheap. And so I thought of it as a country that made cheap things in Asia. But I didn't know very much about Japan at all. We had a short orientation, so I read the complete history of Japan. But it didn't prepare me culturally. We didn't have a formal Japanese class. There was a Japanese international student who taught the students who were interested in learning Japanese, but it was outside of class time. And we had what was called Japan table in the cafeteria. It's an all dormitory college. So all the students live on campus. So there are large cafeterias for all the students to eat in. And they have Japan table where use chopsticks, and I learned a few words of Japanese. But before I came, I didn't know simple things like I didn't know that toilet was going to be different. In 1969, there were very few Western-style toilets in Japan. There were very few flush toilets in Japan, unless you went to a hotel or business office. I didn't know that it was going to be really humid. I didn't know anything about the diet. I didn't know that it was basically rice and vegetables, fish. Growing up especially in South Dakota, where there are more cows than there are people, and beef is really cheap. I didn't think about the food. I didn't think about the lifestyle. So for me, and I think for the other students too, the culture shock was much greater than if a student now would come to Japan. They know more about Japan. Japan has changed. The United States already had McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken when I was a kid. So the idea of fast food had already started. We had, I think, Shakey's Pizza. So there were lots of foods. Japan still didn't have hamburgers, fried chicken, or pizza. First pizza pie that I had in Japan, they heard the word pizza pie, so it had lots of sugar in it. They made it as a pie. So I didn't know very much about Japan. So the culture shock was big. I got sick when it started to be cold. I had a rash all over my body. I had a temperature of about 102. I got physically sick from the difference in climate, the difference in water, the difference in food, the difference in culture, the difference in language. And I think a lot of people think of culture shock as only a mental or emotional reaction. But Lorraine Barna, who's also one of my mentors, did a lot of work on the physical aspect of culture shock. And culture shock is like when you go on a roller coaster, your hormonal levels change. So even if you think you're not having culture shock at all, you are, because the colors, sounds, smells, everything changes. So your hormonal balance changes. If it changes a lot, you get sick. I didn't know that at that time. I didn't even know the word culture. I just knew that I didn't know much about this country I was in. But I fell in love with Japan at first. I don't know if it's first sight or first smell. Because I came to Japan in June, and I'd grown up mostly in South Dakota where it doesn't rain, I'd never had an umbrella. And all of a sudden, everyone had an umbrella. It's very muggy. And because there weren't, even public toilets weren't flush toilets. There was a strong smell of toilets, a musty smell. And a lot of people, the other students I was with, thought it was a terrible smell. I thought it was a great smell. Even when I was a kid, we didn't have any rain in South Dakota, but we had flush toilets, and it always, why do we have such a limited amount of water? Why do we use it to flush away waste material? Ecology, we didn't even have that word. But the first Earth Day was 1970, the year that I graduated from Carlton. And I went to the first Earth Day. So that was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It started this idea of pesticides and herbicides were not good. The idea that we shouldn't control nature, we should live with nature. So this whole interest in Zen Buddhism, this interest in Japan, was coupled with this rising awareness of environmental issues. So when I came to Japan and they didn't use water that way, I liked the smell of toilets, the musty smell. So I sort of fell in love with Japan from the beginning. And even though it was an extreme culture shock, I enjoyed living here. And even though I knew I was going back at the end of my 6 months, I already in my mind was coming back. I wanted to come back. I didn't plan to come back and stay for 50 years. Now I've been here 51 years. I certainly didn't plan to stay that long. But from not knowing anything about the country, I certainly became interested in Japan after I got here. You have this question about how much familiarity you have with Japanese television. Zero. Back in the 1970s, a Tokyo University professor published in English something that I've happened to read. And he had his students compare the amount of news about the United States that Japanese get in newspapers, magazines, television, radio, and the amount of information that Americans got about Japan, newspaper, magazines, television, radio. He used those four. And at that time, it was about 40 to 1. Japanese had 40 pieces of information about the United States to every one piece of information that Americans had about Japan. So I had zero familiarity with Japanese television.
When you were teaching during the 70s, what career goals did you have beyond teaching, if any?
Zero. Even though I had an affinity to Buddhism, I grew up Christian, and I still pray. My prayer, I'll say my prayer for you, so you can put it in your thing if you. I say it probably 7 or 8 times a day. Thank you for the universe. Thank you for all the galaxies. Thank you for our galaxy. Thank you for our solar system. Thank you for the sun, the moon, and the stars, and this earth with its soil, air, and water, this organisms that support the life of plants and animals, support the life of humans, all connected by love. Thank you for everything. That's my basic prayer that I say every day. I'd always approached life as a sort of an experience of learning things and connecting more and more. So I'd never looked at life as something that I would plan out. Well, life was something that would meet me and I would connect with it. So I had no goals at all. If people ask me, how long am I going to stay in Japan? A couple more years and we'll go back to the States. I didn't really think about what I was going to do if I went back to the States. But I certainly didn't think when I started teaching at Dosha High School that I was going to stay for 22 years. But they did give me a house, a large house, 10-room house with a garden. I put in a big, I dug down about 4 or 5 feet and put in gravel and then sand, made a big sandbox, cement block around it, and put in a chin-up bar and a bar that you can twirl around, a lower one, so a high bar and a low bar. And I had a basketball hoop up for my kids. We had pet rabbit, pet chicken, pet dogs, pet cats, tropical fish, hamsters. So it was a really easy environment. It was less than a 5-minute walk. It was 100 yards to school. And I paid 10,000 yen. When I started teaching, it was 360 into the dollar. So it's not very, $30 a month rent. And that was 120,000 yen a year. And that was their budget for having the gardeners come in and clip the trees and the hedge and things like that, take care of the house. And so the budget for taking care of the house and the garden was my rent. So I lived there for free. And my wife and I started our English school there. So we were teaching in the evenings. So it was quite easy to raise a family. And it was quite a good life. And at that time, the area was in the northern part of Kyoto, and the streets were all still either dirt or gravel, not a lot of cars. There was a small stream near the house and big fields to play in. So it was a nice place to raise kids. We raised our kids, 3 sons. Now, Ken is 46. He's an associate professor at Emory University in the Department of Medicine. Got his PhD at Tokyo University in medical psychology. Second son, 44 years old, in San Diego, has always worked in computer industry. His company is a subsidiary of Intel. And third son, 43, who still lives in Japan, about 50 yards from our house. So he has a cafe bar in our house. Comes to the house every day. But anyway, when I was teaching at Dosha High School, I had no career goals other than to go back to the United States someday, not knowing what I'd do. But then I got interested in intercultural communication and decided to go for a master's degree. And I think I was 34. We had a softball game between Dosha Junior High School teachers and Dosha High School teachers. And the Dosha Junior High School teachers didn't have enough players, And one of the teachers had asked a guy one of his neighbors, to join their team. And the neighbor was publisher for a textbook publishing company. So he heard me speaking Japanese. I was playing first base, and when he got a hit, I talked a bit. And he asked me after the game if I was interested in writing a book about the Beatles. And at this time in Japan, sports, music, entertainment were seen as very low class. So there was nothing about sports or music in textbooks, in English textbooks. But he wanted to do a textbook on the Beatles, what's called a sub-reader, used by teachers where the students, it's used for intensive reading along with a grammar-based textbook. So he asked me if I'd like to write a book about the Beatles. And I said, well, I really like the Beatles. So I did a lot of research and wrote a book called The Beatles Once and Forever. And it sold 40,000 copies in the first month because there were a lot of teachers, English teachers in Japan who'd grown up as Beatles fans, who wanted their students to read about the Beatles. And we'd put in questions and made a short test so they could give the students a test along with an answer key. So it was really easy to use the book. And so I was on a television interview about this textbook. It was my first time to be on Japanese television. The next year, he asked me if I'd like to write a book about Takamiyama, who was the first foreign-born sumo wrestler to win a sumo tournament. He'd come to Japan in '64, and he won this tournament in Nagoya. I think it was '68. So I was a fan of his, and he was in Tokyo, called and asked if I could interview him, and he said sure. And so I interviewed him, and based on those interviews, I wrote a book called A Bridge to Understanding the Life of Takamiyama, which also became one of those sub-readers. And then he opened his own sumo stable in Tokyo. And because land prices were so up till then, sumo stables had been one story, long buildings. I think that's where we get the word stable, because they look like horse stables. And the rooms were on each side. And of course, the dohyo where they practiced was on the first floor. Takamiyama didn't have enough money to buy that long kind of stable, so he bought a piece of land and built up. So he had living quarters, eating quarters, sleeping quarters above the dohyo. And he also put in a weight training room under the dohyo. And so this was, in Japan, like sacrilegious. Now, all the sumo stables are built in that same way because land is so expensive. But at that time, he was criticized for this. The firstborn sumo wrestler now became an oyakata, had his own stable, in building such a sacrilegious dohyo. And so a lot of people came to the opening of his stable. And my book just came out then, and I gave him, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 copies of it to hand out to people as gifts when they came to this sumo stable opening. So a lot of news people, a lot of other people got this book. And one of the people was Ohashi Kyosen, who had the television program Sekai Marugoto How Much. I know that this is a very roundabout way to answer a question about career goals. But up until then, I'd never thought about doing anything other than going back to the States. But since we raised our children in Japanese, we decided to really not teach them English. Even though I didn't have a major in nonverbal communication at that time, and I didn't really even know the word nonverbal communication, I had a feeling that just teaching a child a language wasn't enough if they didn't have the cultural underpinnings. So if we were going to teach them English, I wanted to be in the States. That's why I kept thinking about going back to the States. When we first got married, my wife, who's Japanese, had been in the States in '64, '65 as a high school student and actually graduated from a high school in St. Louis. They gave her a diploma. So she knew the States, and at that time, Japan was harder. The States had large washing machines, large refrigerators, big shopping centers. The States was just so much easier to live. She wanted to go to the States right away after we got married, but I was still in love with Japan. So we had decided that when our kids were like in elementary school, we'd move back to the States. But as they got older and Japan got easier to live, Japan also got big refrigerators, big washing machines. She became less and less wanting to go to the States right away. And I always liked Japan. So at this time when Ohashi Kyosen-san saw my book, Takamiyama and I were on a Sekai, a press conference, and his Japanese was not so good. My Japanese is much better. So I answered a lot of questions at the news conference. And Kyosen saw the news conference, and he had the book. And so I got a telephone call from his office, Kyosen Jimusho. Would I like to come onto the program, Sekai Marugoto How Much? And I'd seen the program because it was one of the most popular programs on television. And at that time, we didn't have internet. We didn't have cable television. We didn't have satellite television. So the 2 NHK channels and the 4 private channels were basically what everyone watched all the time. So I did know the program. So I told him I'd have to ask my school principal. So I asked the school principal, and he said he liked the program too. So he said, sure, that's great. And then after going to Tokyo and appearing on that program, then they asked me to be on it again, and I was on Tetsuko no Buhiya. It's one of the longest running. It's still running in Japan. It's an interview program. It's on 5 days a week. And they interview major sports figures, entertainment figures, political figures. Tetsuko is, she's over 90 now, still interviewing. So that's one of the major interview programs in Japan. And I was on twice. As I got more offers to be on television, 2 things happened. One was they asked me to come to Tokyo. They said, you can make so much more money television than you can from teaching high school. And just get a job where you have, katagaki in English, something that goes under your name that says what you do. It's very important in Japan to have, if I would just teach like one class as a part-time teacher at a famous school in Tokyo, then I would be able to put that school's name under my name when I was on television. So I wouldn't just be Jeff Berglund. I'd be Jeff Berglund teaching at such and such a school, like one of the famous schools, like Waseda. Waseda has a high school, one of the other famous high schools in Tokyo, because I've been teaching, 22 years in high school level. I not only wrote the Takamiyama book and the Beatles book, I'd written 6 or 7 more books. I'd also helped with some basic textbooks. My name was in a lot of textbooks. So it would be easy to get a job like that. So one thing was this idea of money. You can make so much more money, at least 10 times more than you're making as a high school teacher, and become a television star. And the other thing that happened was I got interested in teaching at a different level, and maybe, I wanted to start teaching at the university level. But I knew that I had to move out of the house. Think about that. So that was the first time I ever thought about a change in careers in Japan. And at that time, so long had gone by without going back to the States. Our kids had grown up that, and Ken was in junior high school. Ken had just started junior high school. So when this big offer came, my wife said, let's go to Tokyo. A lot more money. But I really liked Kyoto, and I didn't like Tokyo. I still don't like Tokyo. I don't feel the warmth of the people as much as I do in Kyoto. Although Japanese people say that Kyoto people are unfriendly. They're not unfriendly to foreigners. So there was a push to have a career change. And I asked a number of people about this choice. One of them I asked was Beat Takeshi. We sort of became friends on the program. Although he's much shorter than I am, he's very broad-shouldered. So he would get a lot of brightly colored shirts, brightly colored sweaters, mostly Yamamoto Kansai, but from different designers who wanted him to wear their clothes on television so that Japanese people would then buy their clothes. And he would always offer me, because he would have this rack of clothes that people had. So he gave me a lot of sweaters and shirts, because even though he's shorter than me, his shoulders are the same size, neck large. So we became, I don't say good friends, but we had a friendly relationship. So I asked him what he thought. And he said, if you're going to be on TV major, don't make it your career. make sure you have a career that's separate, because television, although it's lots of money, it's like I was making 5-6 million yen a year as a high school teacher. They said I could easily make that in a month on television. So that's more than 10 times what I was making as a high school teacher. And he said, don't be the lure of, the lights and people noticing you on the street and the money. Don't just go for that. He'd also grown up poor, not very rich family, not even middle class family. So he was always worried about his roots, keeping his roots. So I think when he was talking to me, he was mostly talking to himself, but that's how he taught. And I think the biggest, I asked a lot of people. I asked other teachers, I asked friends, and some people said, go to Tokyo, you get exciting, you get a big career change, you get lots more money. Some people said, Tokyo, not like Kyoto, you live in a nice house now, you're in the country, on the outskirts of Kyoto, you got the perfect life. So there were opinions on both sides. But my son, that had just started junior high school, the son that later went to Tokyo University, and as you know, Tokyo University is known as the most elite of schools in Japan, so it's hard to get into. And I'm getting into Tokyo University, then getting his master's and PhD at Tokyo University. That's big. He's a smart kid. And he said, when I asked him, if you're going to go to Tokyo for the money, I don't think that's your lifestyle. I don't think that you've thought about money as being the most important thing in life. So if you're going to go to Tokyo for the money, I don't think you should go. If you're going to go to Tokyo because you can do something there that you can't do here and you want to do it, you should go. So that was really the deciding voice when I decided not to go to Tokyo. 25 years later, no, I was 25. He was in his 30s. He had kids. He was back here and visiting us from the States. And he and I were sitting up drinking some wine at night. And he said, do you remember that time you asked me about going up to Tokyo? I said, yeah. And he said, he didn't want to go to Tokyo because he had his friends in Kyoto. He didn't want to be uprooted, change schools. So he thought of the one thing he could say that would keep me in Kyoto. So he actually said that for his own purposes. But that's really the deciding thing that kept me in Kyoto. And although I did a lot of TV work in Tokyo, and I still do once in a while go up to TV programs in Tokyo. In fact, I have an interview this afternoon for a new program in Tokyo. The director's going to interview me this afternoon. So I'm not averse to going to TV programs in Tokyo. I do it once in a while. But I decided to stay in Kyoto, and so most of my TV work became centered around Kyoto, Osaka area. For example, I hosted a program on NHK 13 years. 3 years was a history program, and then 10 years was a program called Kirattoikiru. People with disabilities would come to the studio and we would talk about their lifestyles. Because in the field of intercultural communication, people think of intercultural communication as only being country culture, but we have gender culture, age culture, area culture, language culture, religious culture, and different cultural groups. And one of them is disabled and abled. And that's what I had focused on. That's what I wrote my master's thesis on. And that's what got me interested in nonverbal communication, because I met disabled people who couldn't use language. They didn't have the digital part of their brain, the left side of the brain, so they couldn't use language. They couldn't understand spoken language. They couldn't spoken or written language. They couldn't use spoken or written language. So communicating with people like that was completely nonverbal, and that was, fun. That's what got me interested in nonverbal communication. So I went from able, disabled, disability culture into nonverbal communication, which is what I do research on now. But that career choice, getting on television, being asked to come to Tokyo, deciding not to go to Tokyo, just around that time, because I was on television, and Sekai Marugoto How Much was one of the 2 or 3 major programs in Japan at that time, along with Naruhodo, Zawarudo. Every week, the viewing audience was at least 20%. So 1 in 5 people in Japan is watching this program. And it was based on intercultural communication theory. intercultural communication theory says that culture groups have different artifacts and behaviors. And with those artifacts and behaviors, they have different norms. And underpinning all that, they have different values and worldviews. So Sekai Marugoto How Much was a program where you looked at the different values of the 5 people who tried to figure out what something cost. So Kyosen-san had planned this. So the first seat was Ishidaka Koji, who'd grown up very rich, still is very rich. So he would have the values of someone who was rich. So if you asked him how much for a resort hotel, he would be able to think of that. You had Beat Takeshi in the second chair, who asked him how much it would cost for a skewer of meatballs in Mexico. He'd be able to relate to that. The third seat was always a woman. The fourth seat was the gaijin seat. And the fifth seat was a cultural person, so someone who was in kabuki, or a curator of an art museum, or the director of a zoo, or someone who was in cultural activities who didn't really have much to do with money. And because of the different values of those 5 people, it was an interesting program. But when I started to be on other programs in Tokyo, like Waku Waku Dobutsu Nando, which was a big popular program, Tetsuko, then I got more and more offers. And it started to conflict with high school teaching because I had my own homeroom. I was a homeroom advisor, and so I had to be at school every day. We had classes on Saturdays too. So I only really had Saturday and Sunday. Sekai Marugoto How Much was on Saturday afternoons. They filmed the program, and I could get up there just in time to shoot and then come back. And I could do programs on Sundays. And I think Tetsuko no Buya, they all often shot on Sundays. So some programs I could do, but most of the programs I had to say no because they were on days when I was teaching. And then I got an offer from a school that, because they'd seen me on television, they knew that I could work as an advertising agent if I had the name of their school, because on a program like Sekai Marugoto How Much, they would have my name with that name of the school underneath it. So that was when I got hired away from Dosha High School to start teaching at the university level. I started at Otemai Joshidai, and then moved to Tezuka Gakuin University, and then 12 years ago moved to the University of Foreign Studies. So now I've been teaching at the university level 28 years. Yeah, 28 years. But I never thought of, I have never had a job interview.
Wow.
I'm sure there are other people who've never had a job interview, but I've never had a job interview. When I came back to Japan with the Perry family and Dosha University professor that had befriended me the year before, introduced me to my home stay family, he just said, come down and teach English at Dosha High School. So I didn't have an interview. And then from teaching, they liked me, and they said, would you like to become a full-time teacher? So I never really had a job interview. When I was asked to teach at the university level, they just asked me to come. I did go in, and it was not an interview like whether I was going to get a job or not. It was an interview whether I wanted the job or not. They tried to convince me to come. So I've never thought about career goals. I enjoy learning new things. I'm not afraid of learning new things. I'm not afraid of being told that I made a mistake, or that something I know is not right. I thought I knew it, but I didn't. So I don't mind being corrected. So still, I like connections with other people. It's a major goal, but I've never really thought about career goals. It's all just been the things that I've connected to. Just did a live internet broadcast of what's called Gozan no Kuribi in English. And I translated as bonfires for our ancestors. There's a period in Japan called Obomo, which is based on Buddhism, but it's more of a Japanese tradition. From the 13th to the 16th of August, the ancestors on the 13th of August come back from the spirit world. People hang lanterns in front of their house to guide the spirits back to the family altar. Many families, we talk about norms as being 70% or more. So it's a norm in Japan there are more than 70% of Japanese families have what's called a family altar. So the spirits of the ancestors come back to the family altar on the 13th, and you pray, you you eat in front of the family altar, so it's sort of you're sharing your time with them. And on the 16th, the night of the 16th, you send them back. And the traditional way is to use fire, like the lantern that you welcome them with. And often in Japan, because you're near the sea, you carry the fire to the sea, and it's in the form of a thing that'll float in water. So it's like a raft with a little lantern on top of it. And you put it into the sea and it floats out to the sea. And, waves wash over it and the candle goes out. But it leads the spirits back to the spirit world. And in Kyoto, we have 5 mountains that have large Chinese characters or pictures. And there are up to 100 bonfires on each of those mountains that are, when they burn together, they show those particular shapes. And because of coronavirus this year, they didn't want to have the usual number of fires because of the amount of people that have to carry the firewood up. The people have to be there to light the fires and watch the fires, make sure that it doesn't spread. And also the huge numbers of people that come to Kyoto to see this event. They wanted to. Are Americans familiar with what we call the 3 C's?
It doesn't ring a bell, so I don't think so. So can you explain it?
Yeah. I just don't know why Americans don't, because it's so easy to do something when you talk about it in a way that makes it easy to remember. The 3 C's are to avoid closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact settings or situations. So the 3 C's is closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact situations. So you got 3 C's. In Japan, it's samitsu. It came from three. Mitsu means amount, heavy amount. So it's heavy amount of people in one space or heavy amount of closeness in the space. So it's samitsu in Japanese. But in English, it was put into 3 C's for foreigners in Japan. So we have to always avoid those. So they had a very small number of fires this year. So we decided to broadcast to the world in English and Chinese. So I did the English, and a friend of mine, both of us are international goodwill ambassadors for the city of Kyoto, did the Chinese. And we did it from the 2nd floor of my house, which looks out on the first set of bonfires, which is lit. And because it's known as sort of the main, it had 6 fires. The other mountains had only 1. The last mountain had 2, but the other mountains only had 1. Instead of 100, they had just 1 bonfire. But we did the bonfires for the ancestors this year.
I wanted to ask about the language when you were first learning it. How long did it take before you could actually converse?
So this is what I tell my English students, is that there are more than 6,000 languages in the world now, and probably there were at least 10,000 languages. Many have disappeared because they don't have a written form, and they're sort of sucked up by large, economically powerful cultures. And then it becomes economically advisable to know the language of the strong culture. So, for example, American immigrants. My great-grandfather immigrated from Sweden. He didn't speak any English. His son, my grandfather, could understand English, Swedish, but not speak it. My father didn't understand or speak Swedish. I never heard Swedish, and that's a pretty standard progression. So many languages disappear because it's economically advantageous for the minor culture group to speak the major language, and then they end up not having their own language, which happened especially American Indians. For example, the Lakota, the Mandan, the Dakota, the 3 branches of Sioux, because they don't have a written language and they're economically advantaged by using English, their language almost died out. Lakota is trying to be brought back, but it's hard because children it's not a mother tongue. Their mother doesn't speak. So you have to teach it in school, and it's really old people that are the only ones to speak it. It's hard. So languages, I think, are so diverse that of all the languages in the world, there are some that are going to fit your personality. will be easy for you to learn, and others which don't fit your personality are harder to learn. And everyone learns that first language that their mother or father speaks, almost always. If you're born deaf and your parents are using spoken language, of course, you're probably not going to learn the spoken language. You're going to learn a sign form of that language. But learning your first language doesn't have to fit your personality. So there are a lot of Japanese people who don't fit in Japan. There are a lot of American people who don't fit in English, but they do because it's their first language. So for me, Japanese was that language. It fit me. So I learned Japanese really fast. And for me, it was really easy. I'd studied Spanish in junior and senior high school. I studied Greek in college. I'd made progress, zero progress. I was called someone who couldn't learn foreign languages. I was smart. I did well in school, but I couldn't learn foreign languages. But Japanese just came to me easily. I could hear a word 2 or 3 times and know it. I started to speak more and more. And then when we went to school, and we had 3 hours a day of intensive Japanese, where we had to learn 50 kanji a day. We were told to learn the first day in class, we were told to learn hiragana by the next day. We'd have a test. And then the next day we were given katakana, and we said we were going to have a test of katakana the next day. The third day we started to learn kanji, and we had between 20 and 50 kanji a day. So it was really intensive. We had to memorize a dialogue every day. We had lots of new vocabulary words. Our textbook, the first half of the textbook was written with English explanations, English translations, and the second half of the textbook was all in Japanese. So it was a very intensive 3 hours a day in class, and Carlton works under a system where it's 3 to 4 hours of outside classwork for every hour in class. So that meant 9 to 12 hours outside of class every day to study Japanese. So it was very, very intensive. And so within that 6-month period, I was speaking fairly fluently. I was able to keep up with most conversations. I still didn't have the vocabulary for like news programs, a program about science. But I got into the beginning of reading and I would buy a Japanese murder mystery and try to read the murder mystery in Japanese. I don't think I'm typical, but I'm sure there are other Americans. Like I've never talked to Kent Gilbert or Daniel Call or Chuck Wilson. Chuck and I were good friends. He was in Kansai before he was on Sekai Marugoto. He chose to move up to Tokyo after that. He was originally in Kansai. We were good friends here. Who's the other?
Derek Kato?
Yeah, Kent Derek. Although all of them were friends, and I've talked with them many times, but I never talked to them about if it was hard in the beginning or not. But for me, it wasn't. Japanese just fit me right away. That's probably another reason that I sort of fell in love with Japan at first, is that the language was interesting. English is a language which is geared more to individualism. And so you learn individual phrases, and often the phrases are different for different people. Japanese is a language that has tons of phrases that everyone uses. So it was really easy to learn those because everyone used them. I think that was one of the things that other students didn't like. They didn't like having to say the same things that everybody else said. But one of the things that drew me to Japanese was that conformity of language, conformity of culture. So it wasn't difficult for me.
Jumping a little bit ahead to Sekai Marugoto, you said that was the first real television show you were regular on. What year, do you remember the year that you first appeared on it?
I would say I was 36.
85?
Yeah.
Okay. Did they give you any sort of special instruction when you were on that panel of how to act, how to talk, anything of that nature?
No. They said that they shot two weeks worth every Saturday. So they said to come up to watch the first one so I'd see what they do. And so this is a story that I don't tell a lot, but it's a really important thing. So I went up early, and they were in the partway through Sekai Marugoto How Much. They MBS made a new building and moved into new studios. But this is the old building, so it's an old studio. The studio is on the first floor, but the director's room where they switch cameras and they, like camera 3, and that was an up on Chuck's face. And camera 1, that would be Kyosen's face. And they would switch the cameras. That switching room, the director's room, was up above that. So we could look down on the studio. And they said, take a chair over there. So I was watching the program being made below and also all this switching going on. And this Japanese man came up to me. He was wearing a beret, and he said, is this seat taken? And I said, no. And so he sat beside me, and he introduced himself. He said, I'm going to be on the program today. And I said, oh, me too. And he said, it's my first time. It's my first time too. And then he said, his name was Tezuka. And of course, that's Tezuka Osamu.
Manga artist.
For my generation, one of the most famous Japanese names, one of the few Japanese names that people that were interested in Japan knew about. He was the creator of Atom Boy. He's not only a certified doctor, but had made many manga about religion. He did a whole series on Buddha, and a lot were connected with medicine. He did one called Nerumo, pop cartoon on television that my children were watching all the time. So, of course, I knew his name. He was famous for wearing a beret. He always wore a beret. So here's this major Japanese cultural icon who's going to be sitting next to me on this program. So we became instant friends, went out to dinner after the program. So I remember quite clearly the first time I went up there. But no one said anything. They explained the rules that I had to answer in the currency of whatever. If they were asking me about Mexico, I'd have to answer in peso. It was France. At that time, there was no euro. It would be franc. Germany would be Deutsche Mark. I would have to answer in the currency of the country we're talking about. That's the only little thing they told me. So, no, I didn't know anything at all.
How well do you think you performed in terms of the game? That was guessing the amounts. And then how well do you think you did as a commenter for entertainment value?
So when I was on the first time, the first question, I don't remember what it was. But at that time, I'd been in Japan 16 years, counting from the time I came as a student, 17 years. But from working, I started teaching in 1970. So I've been 16 years in Japan. But I still was more American than Japanese. So it was easier for me to think of these things when they asked how much is this in dollars. So I would think in dollars and then change the dollars to yen because I knew the exchange rate for yen, and then change the yen because they would give like 1 peso is 0.003 yen. 1 peso is 70 yen. They would have a conversion mark for yen. So I would change my dollars into yen and then change the yen, whatever the currency was. And in the first question, I made a mistake and I multiplied instead of divided because I was doing a double conversion. So when they say, everybody has written their answer, put out your answer. And I put out the answer, then I can see the other people's answers next to me. And I saw that mine was vastly different by 2 or 3 integers. I immediately said, Shimota, which is strong Kansai Ben. And back in middle of the 1980s, there wasn't this big movement of Kansai people up to Tokyo hosting programs like now there's Sanma, there's Downtown, there's the next wave of young entertainers that all grew up in the Kansai area speaking Kansai dialect, getting jobs with Yoshimoto Kogyo and then moving up to TV programs in Tokyo, now hosting a lot of the programs in Tokyo. But they're all originally speaking Kansai dialect. At that time, there wasn't that. There weren't any of those people. So the minute that I said, Shimota, the standard Japanese is shimatta, shima, and then it has a small su between the ma and the ta, so it's shimatta. Kansai Ben is shimota. There's no shimota. It's not a change. It's a change 2 ways. It changes the ma to mo, but it also gets rid of that, putting the sounds together. Shimota. And there was a silence in the whole studio, like the gaijin in his first time in the chair had made a mistake in Japanese. That was I didn't realize that that was what happened, but I knew that everyone went really silent. And then Tezuka Osamu is from Kansai. He's from Hyogo, from Kobe, from this area. So he translated, and he said, "Shimatta no koto desu." But I still didn't understand that he was translating my Kansai dialect into standard Japanese. And I said, I thought that they were asking the reason why I had said that. Shimota means, I did it. Oh, I made a mistake. So I thought they were asking why I made a mistake. Shimata means, I wish I could take this back. I did a bad thing. I did it. So how foolish I was. And so I thought they were asking me why. So then I said, Kei-san machigota. No one had ever heard Japanese on television yet. Kei-san machigattan desu would be standard Japanese. Kei-san machigota is a completely different sound. It's the sound of Kansai dialect, a dirtier sound. It's not as clear a sound. And some people think it sounds like you're angry because it is the sound. The major Yakuza groups are Kobe. They speak Kansai dialect. So it's often known as the Yakuza, the language of the Yakuza. So then when I said that, Kei-san machigota, then Tezuka says they again translated, Kei-san machigattan desu. And then suddenly I realized, he's translating my Kansai dialect. Because they had said to me before the program started, it's okay to use Kansai dialect. They knew that I spoke Kansai dialect. It's okay. I think one of the assistant directors was from Kansai that worked for NPS had said that to me. So my start in the program was Tezuka Osamu, this major icon of Japan, translating my dialect. So after the program, they said, with your level of Japanese and your level of handsomeness, when I was younger, I used to be handsome, and your personality, you can do all kinds of TV work in Tokyo. So as far as being commentator, as far as being a speaker on the program, they really liked me, and the audience liked me, and that's why they kept asking me to come back. I think I was on 10 or 11 times. And as far as a game show, I did a hole-in-one once, and I collected 10 near-pins twice. So I was quite good on the show. And then you asked me if I took a trip around the world.
Did you take the trip that you won when you got the hole-in-one? Yes.
No, by Japanese law at that time, they could not give money. One trip around the world was, I think, at that time about a million yen. They couldn't give it as cash, but they could give it as certificates for travel. So I didn't have to take a trip around the world. I could take other trips using the same amount of money. No. I did the near pin 10 twice, and I ended up with, I think it was 7 last time I was on the show. So I did one hole-in-one and one set of 10 pins. So I got 2 trips around the world. So with the 2 million yen, I had my 3 cents and my wife. We took 2 major trips where the hotels and the airplane, everything was paid for by the certificates that they had given me. So I didn't take a trip around the world, but I did use the money. But like Ishizaka Koji, Takeshi, they would give away theirs to their younger staff, or like Takeshi had his own office then, Office Kitano, that he would give to the younger people who were coming in. But I used them with my family.
Just a quick question about 3. Ohashi Kyosen, what are your thoughts and memories of him?
Oh, he was a great guy, and he often invited me in. It was strange because he would invite me into his room to just talk. Although I still didn't have that intercultural communication master's, and I still didn't even know about value differences and worldview differences in that sense, in the academic sense, I still had this idea that this show was exciting because people had different values. So that was his major thing. I think it was the first program on television that had the name of the host first. There were lots of other programs like Sekai Marugoto How Much was a popular program. Naruhodo the World and Waku Waku Dobutsuran were famous. But Sekai Marugoto How Much was actually, when they said the name of the program, or when it was written in the newspaper, it was written as Ohashi Kyosen no Sekai Marugoto How Much. His name was listed first. Because from his travels, he had the idea that he was a world traveler, that people did have different values. And he had this idea that if people with different values tried to evaluate something, like for me, trying to evaluate brand name fashion, I get most of my clothes at the Gap, or I'm not a fashion person. But someone who's really into fashion would be able to evaluate that. So Kyosen-san had this idea that people did have different values, and that if different values came out in the program, it could make interesting talk. So he is really one of the ones who thought of the program, created the program. So that's why they put his name in it. But I remember once when he invited me into his office, and he had a new pair of underwear, and he said, "Can you turn your back?" And he changed his underwear. He was changing clothes between the two shootings of the program. He was just a really nice guy. He was very intelligent, very on the ball.
Isaka Koji-san?
Never got to know him. Yeah, never got to know him. I mean, he was on the program every time I was on the program. But he was 2 seats away. He would say, "Ohayou gozaimasu," or "Genki desu ka," or something like that. But I never really talked to him. Takeshi was right from the beginning. The first time I was on was Kusabue Mitsuko, and I talked to her a bit.
Did you ever get to know, I guess, was he Beat Takeshi? Did you ever get to know the Kitano Takeshi persona? Or do you consider them two separate people? I don't know if there's a way to make sense of that, but...
Yeah, I think they are two separate people, yeah. Beat Takeshi was, grew up in a lower class family, got on TV with his comedy. He was in a manzai duo. He was really funny. He was good at talking, so he got into more and more talk programs. I think Sekai Marugoto How Much is really a big breakout program. But I think he always had this really serious side. He has a brother, and his brother and I also got to know each other on other programs. His brother is a famous scholar, and I think Beat Takeshi wanted to become Kitano. He wanted to show that he had and I think that's when he got into the idea of directing movies, and more controlling TV content, controlling TV programs. But I saw him on the Shinkansen years after the Sekai Marugoto How Much program, and I hadn't seen him since the end of that program. No. He had invited me a couple times up to a program that he'd started in Tokyo. So I've been on a program that he hosted in Tokyo. I hadn't seen him in 3-4 years. And I was sitting reading a book, and he got on at a station after me. And he actually came up to me and said, "Sashiburi desu." And this is when he is Kitano Takeshi, and I think he had won an Academy Award, or at least a Japanese Academy Award, and was celebrated. So he's becoming like world famous. But he still had that not stuck up, "I'm better than you." So he still had his same old, "How's it going?" atmosphere. So I do think the persona is different. I think he can switch back and forth and still has that Beat Takeshi. Even in major programs, he'll sometimes you can see him with a little smirk, and he's switching back to that Beat Takeshi humor kind of thing. He's a really interesting guy.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about it. What do you think separated Jeff Berglund from other foreigners who were on Japanese television at the time? I don't know if you had anything more you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think that Beat Takeshi's advice was really good, to keep a major career and keep television as a secondary. So everyone has always understood that about me, that it's a secondary thing. It's not, TV is not my major form of income, and it's not my major form of work. So there's an appeal about that you're professional in your TV work, that you're not coming on as just a university professor, but you're professional in that you've had a vast experience, but that you're not a TV personality, you're not a celebrity, that's not your main thing. And I think more and more foreigners who are on TV in Japan do have a separate vocation or job title. But there weren't a lot of foreigners on television back in we got more and more in the 90s, and then after 2000, it really started to take off. And then it was 2005 maybe, it was half that started becoming, or second generation. So there's all kinds of foreigners in Japan. And recently, for the first time in a major television program, and it's stated the director, producer, camera work, writing work, everything was done by foreigners, and all of the people on the program were foreigners. So this was a serious program looking at foreigners in Japan and looking at the diversity, because Japanese tend to see themselves as a monolithic group. Although it's, of course, changing. It's changed in the 51 years I've been here. And there's more of an acceptance of diversity. But still, Japanese tend to think of themselves as a monolingual, monocultural group. And so they see foreigners as outside that. And so they see all foreigners as being the same, being not Japanese. But now when you have second or third generation foreigners, parents and grandparents were Koreans before them, but Koreans on the whole melded into Japanese society, Japanese culture, Japanese language. Of course, there's still the Chongyong group that runs schools and is still strongly learning Korean language and culture, but they're becoming smaller and smaller in number. Koreans have taken Japanese nationalities larger, so there's not that large group of Koreans anymore. And now you have people from all over the world, like you have Darvish, whose father is playing professional baseball in the United States, but having grown up with his mother tongue being Japanese. So you have this real mixture. And I think the foreigners who are on television now aren't on because they're a rarity. They're not on because they speak Japanese. Or the time I was on, that was the major thing. You had to speak Japanese. You had to fit in. I remember when I was on a program they called Kurofune, and it had the exponent too. So it had to be a Japanese word, Kurofune, Pechakucha, and some word for talking. So it was like the idea that the foreigners who came in the black ship, Kurofune means black ship. And all of the people on the program were foreigners. And I was MC. Daniel Carl, that was one of his first major television programs. His first major work in like the industry, I was the host of a in-flight program for, I think it was Anna, but it might have been Chow. It was one of the two major Japanese airlines. Oh, it was Anna, yeah. And he was a reporter. He would go out into the countryside and take trips by plane and then come to the studio and report on those. And I was in the studio emceeing this. So a couple of his first major pieces of work were programs that I was hosting. But when I was hosting that, I was 51, 52. And my first granddaughter was born when I was 49. But I still looked around 30. So when I said that I wanted, to talk about my granddaughter on the program, because of this large mixture that my son, half American, half Japanese, married a woman from Aomori whose father was half Russian, so she's quarter Russian. There's this big mixture in my granddaughter, and I wanted to talk about that. They didn't want me to say that I had a granddaughter because I looked young. They didn't want people to know my age. Japanese people had a very definite idea about the look they wanted. They wanted white people or really interesting black people. They didn't want Asians who spoke. They didn't want Asian Americans, Asians from Europe. They wanted white, mostly white, blonde-haired, who spoke Japanese well, who fit in Japan, who didn't talk about political problems, and didn't talk about human rights and things like that. So that's really changed and become much more diverse.
Actually, before we do that, I want to talk jump a little note on Waku Waku Do Mutsu Rando. I hope I got that right. Just a quick thought on that program, and if anything that differentiated it from Sekai.
So, Sekai Marugoto How Much was where you had people talking about how they evaluate something. And the things were very interesting, like a country in Africa, 11 months of the year, the riverbed is dry. You can drive across it. But in the rainy season, it becomes this huge river. But they don't want to build a bridge for just the 1 month. So they have rafts to pull cars across the river. So how much does it cost in local currency to get pulled across the river? So you learn something about the world. You learn something interesting about a country you never thought about before. And you get to evaluate, is the lifestyle there really low, or, how high is their lifestyle? How expensive is it? Wako Dobu-san was the same kind of thing. You learned about animals. You learned about animals, domestic animals and rare animals in the world. You learned about their sleeping habits or eating habits or mating habits or all interesting kinds of things. So it was the same kind of a quiz program where you would answer quiz about animals. But I think they sort of ran out of topics. The other major program, which was Naruhodo Zawarodo, I was never on, is still going, where they're asking questions about the world, anything about the world. So they can ask about animals or culture or buildings or anything. So they don't run out of topics. Sekai Marugoto How Much? I heard rumors that some of the staff had told one of the contestants an answer or near an answer. And Kyosen found out about it and stopped the program. And they talked him into not quitting the program. And then it happened a few years later a second time. And then there was a strong rumor that no one was ever fed answers. That it was not prescripted. The opposite, that Kyosen was extremely rigorous about guarding those secrets, not letting any of the contestants know.
You talked before about how you refused work, or you were unable to do work based on scheduling. Did you ever refuse any work based on embarrassment or, I don't know if superiority is the right word, but feeling that a project was beneath you, or something, if that makes sense?
International students especially often ask me, how did you become so successful in Japan? And then I veered off into the internet live broadcast of bonfires for our ancestors. And the reason I veered off is because after that, a good friend of mine, direct descendant in line in the company they own, I think he's 14th. And it's a sake. And he's the president of the Japan Sake Association, so he often travels to Europe, South America, Africa, promoting Japanese sake. So he was watching the program, and he sent me a message, and he said, Jeff wa Kyoto no takara desu. You're the treasure of Kyoto. And it's one of the nicest things anyone ever said about me. But because I live in a former Japanese inn, which was visited by Shinsengumi at the time at the end of the Edo period. Inn was here, and visited by one of the leading thinkers of that time, who was assassinated about 100 yards south of this, and who left a writing in the house, and may have written it the actual night that he was assassinated. This was a place that was known for its good food, and probably rented the whole upstairs space. But I live in a house right on the Kama River. I have one of the what are called yuka. They're verandas over the river, only in the summer. There are less than 100 of them. I have a house with a large yuka. We can sit 40 people. And that main character that's one of the bonfire characters is visible right from the house, so we could shoot from our second floor. So I also, professor, head of a department. I have TV and radio work. I have written a lot of books. I've written 4 books in Japanese, working on a 5th now, as well as 11 books in English. International students often ask me, why are you so successful? How you this? And I always answer the same answer, but I never said no. When someone asks me to do something, like if someone asks me to check their English, a doctor in the neighborhood is going to an international conference and has to read his paper aloud and wants me to check his English. So go through and check the grammatical mistakes and practice with him. I never asked how much you're going to pay me for this. I never asked how much. And when I went up to Sekai Marugoto How Much, it was the second time I went. And I asked the assistant director in the elevator, do I get any money for this? And he said, ask your manager. And I said, I don't have a manager. And he said, yes, you do. And I'd been signed up with the company that Kent and Chuck were in without knowing it. They didn't ask me. Really, that was the first time I knew that I had a manager. The first time I really knew I was in their company was when I got the New Year's card from the company that year and had my name listed number 3 in their list of the talent in the company. So I got my manager without really knowing about it. So I didn't go up to Sekai Marugoto How Much knowing that I was going to get money. So I've never asked about money. I never asked about, what's in it for me. But I have had scheduling problems the busier I get. And that was nice to have a manager, because the manager was the one who would weigh 2 different or 3 different things were going to come on the same day, whether we could schedule 2 of the 3 or whether we only had to choose 1. And then the manager, because managers work percent of what you pay, commission, they want to go to the one that gets the most money. But then that made that I didn't have to make any of those decisions. So I left that management company because I started to do almost all my work in Kansai, and they were in Tokyo, and it didn't work out. So I now I do have a business manager, and he makes all of those decisions. So I never had to make a decision based on something like that. But he would also think about whether it might be embarrassing. So a program where, for example, the foreigners are required to yell, not like things about Japan, and they're supposed to yell out something they don't like about Japan. That doesn't really fit my personality. So I remember it was 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that there was an offer to be on a program like that. And he turned it down. He told me about that. But I have never actually myself negotiated a program for scheduling reasons or for any other reason. It's always my manager who does that. I think of every television program, every radio program, every speaking engagement, every class that I teach. I always think of them as a possibility for me to learn something. So I'm always excited when a student says something that I don't know, especially if they say something that I don't know that leads to being interested in something that I've never thought about being interested in. So television is a place to learn things, lots of things.
Are you aware of the stereotype? I don't know how much this gets back to Japan. The stereotype that most Westerners associate with Japanese game show variety shows. If not, I can elaborate a little bit on it.
No, I think on the net I have seen, for example, where sexually dressed women were part of the show and was on in the States. That was the reason it was on the net. I found a program on the net. But no, I don't really know about it.
Okay. I don't know if you have any thoughts on. It's sort of the most Americans, when they think of Japanese television in terms of game shows, they think of things like, at least now they do, Zagaman, the Ultra Cuisine, the sort of the more extreme television that came out of Japan in the 80s and 70s. I don't know if you even saw those shows, let alone have any thoughts on them.
You're talking about the programs where you start out with 20,000 people in a stadium and they answer yes, no questions, and they keep getting down and down and down and down, and finally they go to the United States and they got 10 of them. They narrow and you keep getting sent back home, and finally end up with 3 of them in New York, and one of them becomes the champion or something. That kind of program.
America Odan Ultra Cuisine, yeah. That's
yeah.
Okay.
I used to watch that. Yeah. So that kind of quiz program, I was only on once. I was on recently.
Oh, really?
A program called Todai-O, which is 5 Tokyo University students and then 5 other people. And often the other people are from the world of entertainment. Mm-hmm. They're professional. They're people who are used to being on camera. But they're smart, people who are highly intelligent. So there is a contest. But we were on 5 foreigners against 5 students from Tokyo. But I'm not used to that kind of pressure. I'm not a quiz buff. I don't know know, a lot of trivia. So I was only on once. I think they did ask me to come back again. There was a scheduling. And I've been on a program called Nepurigu, which is also a quiz program. But you have to write kanji. I'm fairly good at reading, but because I use a word processor, I don't write kanji. I can sort of visualize the kanji, but I can't write it. So I don't like that program but yeah, I know that kind of program.
Okay. You never did, just a yes or no, Kuizu Hyaku Nin, the Family Feud, Kuizu Hyaku Nin ni Kikimashita? I know they had a lot of feuders. Okay. So I want to make sure.
We were, as a family, we were on a program like that, but it wasn't that program.
Okay. Do you think that the average Japanese person has an accurate view, today, has an accurate view of the Western world based on the media that they get from the West?
I'll say two things. One is that the Japanese understanding of the world has changed in the 50 years I've been here, so that Japan is much more aware of the world than they were before, much more attuned to the world than they were before, much more knowledgeable about the world than they were before. And second, if you're comparing them to Americans, they're 1,000 times more knowledgeable about other countries than Americans are. I don't remember the number, but I think it's close to 50% of Americans don't have passports. They're not interested in other countries. America is the only country in the world. When you get out of the United States for a long time, you see how different the United States is than all other countries in the world. I remember going back I'd been in Japan maybe 10 years, and I went back and people asked me how Japan was. And this was the time when people were talking about the Japanese economic animals. And Japan was workaholics, and lived in rabbit hutches. So Japan was a sort of controversial topic in the States. So people usually don't want to hear about other countries in the States. You show them a couple pictures of Japan, they say, oh, it looks nice. And that's all they want to know. They don't really want to hear stories about Japan. And they don't want to hear any stories that are critical of the United States. And that goes for Democrats as well as Republicans. Barack Obama was the first president who is a cultural relativist. And because of his own family background, growing up in elementary school in Indonesia, father from Africa, mother from Midwest, being born in Hawaii, he's very mixed. He was the first, what we call cultural relativist, who sees that cultures are not better or worse than others, they're relative to others. But America is the only country in the world where every politician has to say, America is the greatest country in the world. They all have to end their speech with, God bless America. God bless these United States. Where they will say something as blatantly false as, America has the greatest educational system in the world. Or even now they'll say America has the greatest medical system in the world, which are demonstrably false. So the United States is sort of different. But when I went back 10 years and people are interested in Japan, they asked me about Japan, I gave them an example. I said, why doesn't the United States use international traffic signs? In 1947, 2 years after World War II, the United Nations saw that people were traveling more and more in other countries, and that road signs in every country were written in the local language. So if you traveled in Saudi Arabia, it was written in Arabic. If you traveled in France, it was written in French. And people who didn't read the language couldn't understand the road signs. So they decided to make picture kinds of signs, and they would standardize them all over the world. So one way, do not enter, was a mark. Round red, blue circles with lines through the middle. And these were, in 1947, put out to be international road signs, and they're used by every country in the world except the United States. And so I said, why doesn't the United States use international road signs? And I remember clearly what 2 or 3 of they said the same thing. You got the question wrong. Why doesn't the rest of the world use the road signs we use? So the United States has a level of hubris, a level that Trump has. I think that's one of the major reasons he got elected. this Make America Great Again, which for Trump is a Make America White Nationalist again. You know, of course I don't like Trump and I completely abhor the things he's done to the United States. But he did ride on that level of hubris that we're the greatest country in the world. We're the top of the world. And American politicians have to say it. America's the greatest country in the world. We're the greatest democracy in the world. India is the largest democracy in the world and better functioning than the United States. India is not going to not count ballots. So Japan, to get back to your question, Japan, almost everything that's published in major European and English-speaking countries is translated into Japanese and comes out within days. Now, Japanese book reading is much greater than it is in Europe. And major books are translated right away. Francis Fukuyama, who wrote about the end of civilization, and he has a new book on the United States now. That came out within days or weeks of the English publication in Japan. Steve Jobs' autobiography came out right away. So Japanese do read the things that Americans or Europeans are reading. We get a lot more diverse television. A Japanese television news show might show excerpts from Al Jazeera, from the Middle East, or from German television, or French television, or Italian television, if it's news about Europe. They might show a local African television station program if it's fitting into the news. So I think Japan is a lot more knowledgeable about the world than the United States is. I look at them both as extremely ethnocentric countries. Japan is ethnocentric in the sense of we're different from everyone else. We're unique. No one is like us. So we have to learn about other people. The United States is, we're the same as everyone. Everyone is basically American at heart. All those Afghanis, they really want democracy and capitalism. They want to be American. It's just that they don't speak English. So I think there's a strong ethnocentrism in the United States, seeing the world as basically the same as us, but having different foods and different clothes and different languages, but basically being the same, wanting the same things. And Japan, seeing the world as all different than us. We're unique. But both of them are strongly what they call ethnocentric, seeing their culture as central. Most countries in the world are ethnocentric. I don't mean that they're unique, but the ethnocentrism is very strong in both of them.
We're going to wrap up shortly from now, but
sorry about taking all your time.
No, you're fine. I could go till 5 in the morning if you wanted to, but I don't want to take up a whole lot of your time. Was there ever a moment when you realized that you were famous, as it were, in Japan?
Yeah, I think it was after the first time on Sekai Marugoto, or after the second time on the Shinkansen. Some stranger said to me, "I saw you on TV." And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. So there was a period when I was on a lot of nationally broadcast programs where people did start to recognize me. And I tried to keep Takeshi's words in mind, not let it go to my head. But now, because most of the work I do is local, a lot of people in Kyoto will recognize me. But as far as nationally, I'm certainly not famous. I've never thought of myself as a famous person. I've thought of myself as someone that some people know from television. I think I'm famous in Kyoto because I've been here for 50 more years. And I do a lot of local television work. Oh, the other time when I was really famous was the Akafuji Mai Rice commercial, which we did a number of different commercials. The first one was Dave Spector and we did together, the first series, but ended up with just me. And then because the Akafuji Mai Otako Akafuji Mai Otako it was on radio and television. They went from a company with a few billion yen in sales to a company with millions of billions. They went to a major corporation through those Akafuji Mai commercials. So they were on television and radio all the time. So my face was on television, my voice was on television and radio. And at that time, like grade school kids would walk up to me and sing the song, or junior and senior high school kids would ask to take a picture with me. That was the only time that I really felt famous was during that time, that commercial.
Did you do a lot or just any drama?
Yeah, I've only done 3, Katsu Kaishū, Godzilla, Rokudo no Tsuma, 3 movies. One time I was on an NHK historical drama, but that I was just an extra. That was really before I was on television. Oh, if you're talking about the first time on television, it was actually when I was here as a student. There was a program called Nikaku to Asobo. Oh, no. That was just after I started teaching, so it was 70 or 71. But when I was here as a student, I was on the NHK historical drama Katsu Kaishū. Later, I had a sort of major part in the Katsu Kaishū movie, but that was much, much, much later, 25 years later. But I was an extra. I was one of the sailors on a ship. But in 70 or 71, Nikaku was one of the major comedians. He's a rakugo, single comedy performance. He was extremely popular in Japan. And he had a program for children. So I was supposed to come on the program, and the children were given this thing in Japanese, like, carry me piggyback 3 times around the room. And it was written in Japanese. And they had to try to use, they had to do it in English. So it was a program where basically you were laughing at kids who were trying to put together a few words of English to try to tell the foreigner to do something that was, and then towards the end of the program, it was scripted that I would say something in Japanese that showed that I was fairly fluent in Japanese and that I had understood all of these things in Japanese that these kids had been working so hard on. So that was really my first major television work. But that didn't lead to anything. The thing that led to something was writing the Beatles Once and Forever and being on television, and then the big one was Takamiyama, and then being on the press conference with Takamiyama and having invited me up to that program. Sekai Marugoto How Much. But yeah, but I was on TV sometimes.
Did you have any acting training?
No,
Okay.
0.
Which television show did you get the most enjoyment out of participating in?
Enjoyment was Sekai Marugoto How Much, because that was fun. Learning was Kirattoikiru, the program that I did where we interviewed people with disabilities about their lifestyles, because I learned a lot of things in that program. And I did that for 10 years. I was the MC for 10 years. So. But the program I enjoyed most was Sekai Marugoto. And I enjoy the program I do now.
Talk about that.
I do a weekly TV program introducing things about Kyoto. You can see it on the internet.
What's the name of it?
Jeff at Kyoto, Kyoto Omotenashi Kyoto. Kyoto Omotenashi Kanko. If you go to the kufs.ac.jp, which is the school website in English, and you scroll down, you'll see it says Jeff at Kyoto. And we do 4 a week, and we're in our 3rd year, so the 8th year of the program, but the 3rd year of putting it on the school website. I wear kimono and introduce things, places, and people in Kyoto.
Professionally speaking, this does not have to be television or media-based. What is your proudest accomplishment?
Having and raising a family.
Outside of family?
Subsisting in Japan. I think being accepted in Japanese society, being asked for advice. I think finishing my master's degree. I've taught more than 20,000 students. My teaching career. I've taken more than 600 students to the United States for homestay English study programs. Yeah, I don't think I'm. If proud of TV work would be Kirattoikiru, the program that I hosted for 10 years, because that was a program that started when people with disabilities were not on television, where the Paralympics, para comes from parallel, so they're at the same time as the Olympics. The Paralympics were not really, no, they're not at the same time, but they're parallel to it. They're right after the Olympics. People didn't talk about them. But the Paralympics now is as big a news story as the Olympics now in Japan. So one of the major forces for doing that was our program. We really broke ground. We didn't get into some of the topics that we really wanted to get into, like how do two people who love each other and get married who can't use their arms and legs, how do they have sex? In a country like Sweden, where you have sex education about that, you have what are called sex counselors who actually come into the room and have to pretend that they're not there, but actually help in the physical process. You can be more open and talk about it on Swedish television because it's a topic in school that children are learning about. But both the United States and Japan are quite prudish countries where you don't talk about sex on television. So we didn't get into some of the topics that we really wanted to get into that people in the disability community really do want information about because our program was not just breaking ground in getting non-disabled people interested in disability culture, but in informing disabled people about their own culture, about the possibilities. For example, we had a person that created blind bowling. And because he liked bowling and he'd gone blind, but he wanted to keep bowling, so he created blind bowling, where he used a rope strung between the place where the balls come out and the place where you keep score, very taut, that you have one hand on to make sure you're walking straight. And that became then, because it was on a national program, the blind bowling groups sprung up all over Japan because no one had ever thought of it before. So I think I'm most proud of that as far as television work.
What advice would you have for someone who wanted to work in the television industry?
Difficult. I would say if you want to work in television in Japan now, you have to have a specialty. And probably the more niche specialty, something that nobody else does. It doesn't have to be related to Japanese culture because there are a lot of specialists on different parts of Japanese culture. But if there's a specialty about something about Japanese culture that no one else does, that kind of thing will get you on television. Having the ability to use multiple languages, not saying no, because I think some people think that, I started out on a major program, but that's not the way it usually works. Usually you work up to a major program. I suppose if you want to be on television now, you want to be in Tokyo. But I think having a specialty, having something that makes you stand out, not only because you're a foreigner, and the more, I'm going to make up a word, camera-esque the thing you do is, like if you collect bottle caps, that's not something that people are going to want to see on television. But if you make drones, and the drones, you can make them small enough to be fireflies in a theater where the story takes place in summer and there are fireflies, and you can have those firefly drones actually flying around the theater above people's heads, blinking off and on. And you also make big drones that are now used because of coronavirus, tourism is going virtual, used in virtual tourism. If you're a drone maker and you can talk about the making drones and using the drones, you can show your little factory, you can show the way you design drones, you can actually move the drones and show what it looks like. You can have a small camera in that firefly that's taking actual images of the audience. If you can do something like that, then television is going to seek you out. And I do know a person who has a drone factory in Kyoto that can do that, but he doesn't speak Japanese well enough to be on television. So I think speaking Japanese well enough to talk about your niche thing in Japanese is a second requirement. So to have a thing that's yours, that makes you stand out, and then being able to talk about it in Japanese.
Final question. What advice would you have for someone who wanted to work in Kyoto specifically?
Same thing. For example, one of the TV programs I do, I interview foreigners who are successful in Kyoto. So I just interviewed a German woman. I say German, but she's dual German-Canadian. One parent is German, one's Canadian. She was born in Germany, raised in Canada, went to French-speaking schools in Canada, so she speaks English, French, German, and Japanese. German is what she would call her mother tongue, but French and English are close behind. But she came to Japan and got a job in an office where pamphlets and stuff into English and putting out information in English. When English speakers would book tours, she would do the booking for them, actually helping. And this is a company that runs all of the jin rickshaws, the rickshaw pulls that are there in their companies in, I think, 12 or 15 major American cities all around Japan. Pull rickshaws and foreigners, very popular foreigners. She got a job in their office, and one day when she was, one of the local attractions near the office is cormorant fishing, where you have the body of the cormorant tied to a leash. You have the cormorant's neck tied tight enough that they can't swallow a large fish, and the cormorant catches the fish, and then you pull on the leash, you pull the cormorant out of the water, take the fish out of the cormorant's mouth, and it's a fishing practice 100 years in Japan. But now it's a tourist attraction. And they asked her, would you like to become a cormorant fisher? And she said, sure. So I was thinking about it. And now she's on television quite a lot because she speaks Japanese, and she has this specialty of being the first foreign cormorant fisher, and one of the only 5 in all of Japan. There are 14 cormorant fishing tourist spots. She's one of the only 5. I know one of the women quit. She's now one of the 4 women in Japan. So if you want to be successful in Kyoto, don't say no. Do whatever someone asks you to do. Try to get a job before you come. She got a job before she came. No, that's not right. She came as a student, and that's led to her getting her. So that was the same with me. So maybe coming as a student would be the best suggestion.
In wrapping up this interview, Jeff Berglund, and taking your time to speak with me and in my limited Japanese. お忙しいところお時間を割いていただきありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。こちらこそありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。